This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. And the Florence County Museum, presenting Edward Gay, an American landscape painter, chronicling Gay's evolving style amid the turn of the 20th century and his unique connections to South Carolina and the National Academy of Design. Now through February 23rd, flocomuseum.org. And Meadow Garden, home of George Walton, one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. Open for tours Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. Learn more at historicmeadowgarden.org and visit augusta.com.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. Today, we'll be talking with Ron Daise about his new novel, Raptors in the Ricelands.
In the book, Ron unfolds a story in a 21st century fictional community near Georgetown, South Carolina, a story which reveals family secrets and conflicts that challenge cultural beliefs.
Conveyed in 4 acts with chapter names that follow the production stages of Carolina Gold rice. Raptors in the Ricelands spans the future, the present, and the past, and fosters a message of connection with African diasporic communities around the globe. Ron, it's great to have you back on the Journal, and I'd like to let our listeners know that I have known and appreciated Ron Daise for more than 30 years. In 1993, he and his talented wife came to the University of South Carolina and helped him form a group of European scholars, what Gullah was all about. You have spent your life spreading the gospel of Gullah.
I think that's right. I'm a native of St. Helena Island, South Carolina. I'm the last of 9 children. Both of my parents were graduates of Penn School, the class of 1933. And I've authored books, done productions about Gullah Geechee culture, history, and heritage. I'm a former chairman, the second chairman of the Federal Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission. And I formerly worked, or I've retired from, work at Brook Green Gardens in Morris Inlet, South Carolina.
Let's explain for folks, you use the term Gullah Geechee. Just define those briefly for our folks.
Surely, Gullah and the word Geechee were, during my childhood, those were words that were used primarily by historians or authors. The word Gullah was the term used to define those descendants of enslaved West Africans who were brought to the Carolina and Georgia colonies during the 1700s and 1800s to produce cash crops. Gullah was the name to define the demographic living in South Carolina and North Carolina, whereas Geechee was the term used for the same group of people, descendants, who lived in Florida and Georgia. It was primarily, either word was primarily considered a speech way. But with the establishment of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission, established in 2006, it was determined that the culture and the heritage of both groups were not disparate, and as opposed to thinking of Gullahs in one community and Geechees in the other, Gullah Geechee would be the term used to define the language, the people, as well as the culture.
And I've got a question about the corridor. You were a part, at least advisory in that, were you not?
I was a charter member
Hot dog.
of the corridor commission.
Yeah.
And I was the second chairman. It was under my watch that the management plan for the corridor was promoted to the public, and that was done under my coordination and supervision.
And we need to have a shout out for our mutual friend Michael, right, who had a...
Yes, Michael Allen. It was under his watch that a special resources study was done, and following the request by Congressman James Clyburn to see the significance of the Gullah heritage of South Carolina. And during the study that Michael Allen led, it was discovered and determined that Gullah and Geechee were groups of people not only in South Carolina and Georgia, but that the culture extended to the southern part of North Carolina from Wilmington County down throughout South Carolina and Georgia, all the way down to St. Augustine, Florida.
And we're really talking about the rice-producing areas of the colonial.
Yes, the rice-producing area right along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean.
While you and others are now celebrating Gullah culture and language, that has not always been the case, and that's one of the key elements of your novel, Raptors in the Ricelands. And so why don't we get into that? Because it opens with a young man and his parents want to make sure that he speaks properly, not how his neighbors are speaking.
Absolutely, and that's the way that it was in my very own household. Because my parents were graduates of Penn School on St. Helena Island, speaking what was at that time considered bad English, broken English, or substandard English was always something we were told to avoid. Whenever we mispronounced a word in our home, we were corrected. And that's the way it was in the school systems, and as well as throughout the community. That speechway was considered a source of embarrassment, as though one were uneducated. And I never thought that I spoke Gullah or Geechee, that speechway. I thought that I spoke quite eloquently, but when I traveled to Hampton Institute, now university, where I attended college, people always heard something different about my way of speech, the inflection of my voice. And on the very first day of college, I heard conversations at the table behind me, and I turned around because I thought, who had left St. Helena Island, who had traveled that I didn't know that they were coming? These were fellow students from the Caribbean islands, Jamaica, and the West Indies. And it was the same cadence, the same inflections. We were island people. We carried ourselves differently, and people heard those differences in our way of speech. And one of the things in Raptors in the Ricelands, I wanted to establish that this speechway continues to this day. And there is nothing about it or our beliefs or cultural practices of which we need to be ashamed, and from which others can learn many significant things about our ways of life, and perhaps incorporate in their own with understanding about them.
Well, as our late mutual friend Charles Joyner, in his book Down by the Riverside, pointed out that over 300 years, particularly in what we now call the Gullah Geechee corridor, the intermingling of black and white culture was incredible. In fact, the late Dr. George Rogers, a native Charlestonian, referred to the uppity Charleston accent as high Gullah.
Why, yes.
The uppity Charleston accent. Okay.
During the time of rice plantations, etc., there were hundreds of thousands of West Africans who were transported to these communities because of their superior skills in rice production. And in many communities, there are thousands of West Africans and 100 or fewer white people. That's why there are many, even contemporary speakers of Gullah Geechee who are white because they or their parents or grandparents grew at a time where there was a large West African presence in their communities.
Let's move on now to Raptors.
Yes.
It's a very interesting novel. You've divided it into 4 sections, and you've geared these sections to the schedule of planting rice.
Yes.
Why?
Because rice was so important to the heritage of our ancestors who were brought to this community because of their superior skills and knowledge about rice production. Not only that, the economic boon from Carolina gold rice is what made plantation owners of South Carolina and Georgia extremely wealthy to the point that they rival the wealth of European royalty. And in Georgetown County, South Carolina, where Raptors in the Ricelands is set, during the 1800s, over half of this country's rice came from the rice plantations of Georgetown County.
And I think it's interesting. You come from the other end of the corridor in South Carolina. You now live in Georgetown, but
Yes,
you come from the Sea Islands, from St. Helena, outside
yes.
Beaufort.
And cotton was king.
Yeah,
And during my childhood, I knew through reading that rice was an important part of our heritage, but I knew nothing about rice production. Rice was not produced on a mass scale in Beaufort County. I've since learned that in nearby Jasper County, also in Charleston, rice growth was prolific, but cotton was the cash crop of Beaufort, South Carolina.
yeah.
In some neighbors' yards, because of their West African heritage, they grew rice in these low-lying fields where, because it's a part of the low country and the water table was always high, that was what helped with the production of rice. And rice was eaten in my home and in my community, as is said with Gullah Geechee people, sometimes not once, twice, but three times daily. But it wasn't until I began working at Brook Green Gardens that I learned about rice production, as I said earlier, which was so very important in Georgetown County, South Carolina.
Well, you mentioned the consumption of rice, and I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, and the big meal
Mhm.
was in the middle of the day, and we always had rice and gravy. We always had it. And
Right.
I currently live with a group of retired folks, and they complain that rice should be on the menu every day, period.
Right.
I can't disagree with that.
But
Right.
it
And
is,
in fact, one of the characters in Raptors in the Ricelands, who is a Binya or a native of a Gullah Geechee community, someone who has been here or Binya, and this character has married a Kumya, someone who has come into or relocated to come here, Kumya, and this Kumya character cannot eat rice. She cannot be in an area where rice is even cooked, which brings out the question about what is the significance of rice to Gullah Geechee people, because he feels, who can he be without eating rice daily, as he has done since childhood? There
well,
are many foodways that are important that are considered staple to Gullah, but what if one's digestive system does not allow him or her to dine on such foods? Does that make them ungullah or ungeechee?
well, they really would be a commune. And that young woman had a very difficult time. Talk about culture shock in all capital letters.
Right.
It wasn't just the rice, it was the worship. I don't remember what the church she had come from, but the church she was attending, when there was a shout, she couldn't believe what was going on.
It was that character's brother who was a pastor, and these twins had grown up in the upcountry. They knew nothing about Gullah Geechee culture and history. And in fact, her twin brother, who was a pastor, had thought that Gullah Geechee people, with their spirituality and their beliefs and customs, were evil minded, that they were not worshiping the true God. But then readers have to, I hope, take into consideration just what is spiritual development and what is the religion of the colonizers, those who enslaved people, who maintained slavery because they thought that's what God wanted.
And I have a question about time period now, where we're talking about this young woman coming to the Low Country. What time period is this?
Well, the book itself spans a time. If those who are familiar with This Is Us, I think this was an NBC
The TV series,
broadcast
yeah,
a
yeah.
few years ago, and some episodes began in the past, and it would skip ahead to the future, and then it would come to the present, and that inspired me in the writing. So this woman who has come to the Georgetown community, her heritage her heritage really began during the period of enslavement, where one of her ancestors had escaped from a plantation in Georgetown County in the fictional Massacre community and had run away and fled to Ohio. And that's where he had met her great great grandmother. And now she, several generations later, has come to the Georgetown community and finds out that, oh, she really is related to people in this community had not known before,
Yeah.
which is something that I think for a number of people continues to this day.
Yeah, she's in the 21st century Alfred when she first has her encounter. And Ron very deftly pointed out she was reared as one of God's frozen chosen.
Ah, one of my fellow Episcopalians, yes.
I resent those comments.
You mean you resemble them? Yeah.
No,
Okay.
no. We could talk about some other denomination, but that's
Let's not.
okay.
Yeah.
We won't get into that. And I think one of the things that really shocks her is, yes, there are people who want to consult a Dr. Buzzard in the swamp.
Yes.
Let's look at Dr. Buzzard for a few minutes. Talk about him.
Sure. Dr. Buzzard was a root doctor, and I am a close relative of the famed Dr. Buzzard of St. Helena Island. His name, his cousin William Gregory. But in my book, Raptors in the Ricelands, the root doctor of the Mossaville community, given the Georgetown surname Duncan, he was William Duncan. And his son, the son of the root doctor, is Gregory Duncan. And one of the things to consider, just what is root medicine? Many people who believe in holistic medicinal practices using herbs and plants are helpful for ailments. Some people regard if there's any root medicine, any type of spiritual, where they conjure images or presence of one's ancestors as some sort of practice of evil, but there is a combination of both in Gullah Geechee communities. One of the practices has been whenever someone dies, personal effects of that person's are placed atop that person's grave. If the person was a cook or a baker, a baking spoon or a bowl. You could see that over the graveyards, the slave graveyards in some communities, in many African American burial places in Gullah Geechee communities. Some of these practices still exist because it believed that a person's spirit does not die and does not stay down in the ground. And when that person's spirit emerges from the ground, he or she would feel at home among his or her belongings scattered atop the grave. There are practices based on other West African religious beliefs, like putting pieces of glass or shells so that there would be a flashing of the spirit, more or less, when these spirits that have emerged from the grave that have not died are continuing to look after and care for the descendants that are still living.
Well, in the novel, Dr. Buzzard lives in the swamp, and there's a way to get in touch with him, and a signal that he is receptive is when raptors or buzzards fly.
Fly, and you get to the river or the creek, and you call Dr. Buzzard, and then 3 buzzards fly over, and then they roll the boat, one on each oar, and one flies ahead until you get to the place where Dr. Buzzard's house was. That was a story that, part of my childhood, that was a belief. But Dr. Buzzard drove a town car during my childhood. And the roadways were connected by bridges.
Well, because you go back and forth, historical events, whether we're talking about the Orangeburg Massacre or we're talking about Marcus Garvey, are woven into the story, I would say, very, very effectively. Somehow, our young couple decide they really want to do something to better the local African American community, and that is a thread you carry through. How successful do you really think they were? It's a very complicated story.
Well, this couple, the Wineglasses, Florence and Chadwick Wineglass, on their honeymoon, they are given a trip to Jamaica. And during their honeymoon trip to Jamaica, they come across the statue for the Right Reverend Marcus Garvey, whom they'd known nothing about. And they learned about his work with Back to Africa movement and his thoughts about empowering African Americans to know their importance. And following that visit, they determined that in some way they want to promote economic legacy for their community members back in Georgetown County. So they begin this practice of spreading economic legacy, philanthropy, but they begin to get raptor-like in their procedures of how they disperse these monies, their personal income, and that's part of the story. But one thing that I wanted readers to determine was when people offer philanthropy, one needs to think about why are they doing this? Are their intentions solely to help you, or what is it that they want for themselves? Because this couple, they get a bit, off kilter in the way that they disperse. And one thing I wanted to show that sometimes with our religious beliefs, as well as in our political intentions, when we are giving people something, generally others want something in return, and they need to be careful about what it is. Sometimes, for instance, not in the novel, but if you are making investments for your portfolio, you need to determine what companies, where these companies that you are making your investment are they tied into the same kinds of philanthropical things that you would like, or something just the opposite?
They also run afoul of an evil white man
Mm-hmm.
uh,
He was trying to culturally appropriate
who who who
aspects of Gullah Geechee heritage
who
for
who takes
economic,
who takes advantage of them,
right.
and Mr. Wineglass ends up in legal trouble.
Or he would have if he had continued, but his wife shows him the error of his ways. And in the end, he wants to engage in a type of philanthropy that assists his family, but also assists community members with integrity.
Do you have a copy of your book with you?
I do.
Okay. The last page, it's about 3 paragraphs. I'd like you to read that passage, if you would.
Okay. The sun was rising as Portia headed south, much later than he'd planned, but with an awareness that his time had been well spent. Overhead, the shadows of 2 raptors, their pairs of large wings circling in flight, did not appear ominous, but majestic. In cemeteries and graveyards, the silent cities of the dead, the souls of settlers who'd scurried away the Cherokees before taking ownership to their homeland and establishing Ownerstown recoiled in horror. The descendants of those they'd enslaved had reclaimed mastery of their culture, their beliefs, their economic destiny, without being returned to their African homelands and without needing handouts. Instead, at times, they uplifted themselves or were uplifted by community members, Black, white, Gullah Geechee, American. Although the surnames of many linked their pasts, presents, and futures throughout centuries to the institution of slavery, changed mindsets unfettered them. Realizing the depth of the pit of trouble, sorrow, and shame that his father's unquestioned words had hurled him into, Chadwick freed his mind and embraced friendship with Florence, with others. And like the wings of angels, the green fronds on the stately lone palmetto tree in Mourning Dove Cemetery moved up and down, up and down. The rustling branches proclaimed it as a tree in a community that was rooted in wisdom, with heritage planted deep, fruitful and blossoming, remaining upright through times of trouble, prosperous from generation to generation. Songbirds trilled and chattered, heralding the affirmations that abounded. All who listened without understanding could not comprehend. Yet the music, the messages, floated on the breezes. In the thermals of warm air or updrafts, the raptors in the Ricelands soared, spreading the wisdom from lives lived and lessons learned.
Wow.
The end.
Yes. I just, that whole passage, particularly the palmetto tree and the raptors on the updraft, it was beautiful. I had to ask you to read that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Ron, I hate it, but Alfred is giving me the wind-up sign.
Mhm.
And so, any last words you'd like before we sign off today?
I would like readers to know that this is Geechee literature, and I want people to realize that our culture continues to this day. It's not dead, it's not dying. Our beliefs and our customs have helped to shape American history and the cultural fabric of the United States.
You're absolutely right. And I want to thank you so much for being with us today on the Journal. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. In Raptors in the Ricelands, Ron Daise has created a story that connects the reader with historical accounts of the Orangeburg Massacre, Black church life as begun during slavery, the launch of white supremacy in Fort Mill, South Carolina, the Reconstruction Era, and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And they all connect through the compelling story of the lead characters.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org as well as from your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.